September, 1943. Nazi-occupied Poland. Barbed wire stretches across a barren hillside outside Krakow. Watchtowers rise above rows of wooden barracks. Thousands of prisoners move slowly through the mud, their eyes fixed on the ground. For them, survival depends on silence, obedience, and luck. Because somewhere above them, watching from a balcony with a rifle in his hands, stands the commandant of the camp. One man. His name is Amon Goeth. Inside the gates of Plaszów concentration camp, life and death often depend on his mood. A moment of hesitation. A step out of line. Even a glance in the wrong direction could be fatal. To the prisoners, he becomes a symbol of terror. A man whose authority is absolute. Yet beyond the barbed wire and the fear, another question remains. Who was Amon Goeth before the war? Was he simply a loyal officer of the Nazi regime, carrying out its brutal policies? Or was he something far darker, a man who embraced cruelty with frightening ease? How does an ordinary individual rise to become one of the most feared figures of the Holocaust? And what does his story reveal about power, ideology, and the darkest corners of human behavior? To understand the man, and the terror he created, we must return to the beginning. To Vienna. To the early years of a boy who would one day become the commandant of Plaszów. Amon Leopold Goeth was born on December 11, 1908, in the city of Vienna, which at the time was the capital of the vast Austria-Hungary. Vienna in the early 20th century was a place of grand culture and intellectual life. Music, philosophy, and art flourished there, and the city was home to some of Europe's most influential thinkers. Yet beneath this cultured exterior, tensions were growing. Political instability, rising nationalism, and deep-rooted anti-Semitism were all present in the society in which Goeth would grow up. Goeth was born into a relatively comfortable family. His parents were involved in the publishing business, specifically producing and distributing Catholic literature. This meant that his family lived with a certain level of stability and financial security. His father, Berthold Goeth, was a businessman who managed the family publishing company, while his mother also participated in the enterprise. Their work revolved around religious publications, books, pamphlets, and printed materials aimed at a Catholic audience. Because his parents were heavily occupied with their business, young Amon spent much of his childhood under the care of relatives and caretakers. In particular, he spent considerable time with his aunt, who reportedly played a significant role in raising him during his earliest years. Some historians suggest that this somewhat distant relationship with his parents may have shaped aspects of his personality. Growing up without consistent parental attention can affect a child in complex ways, though it would be far too simple to draw a direct line between such circumstances and the brutal man he would later become. As a child, Goeth was described by some acquaintances as energetic and stubborn. He was not known for academic brilliance, but neither was he considered incapable. Instead, he seemed restless, a boy who struggled to fully engage with traditional schooling. Teachers often noted that he lacked discipline and frequently appeared uninterested in formal education. The world around him, meanwhile, was undergoing dramatic changes. When Goeth was just 10 years old, the empire in which he had been born collapsed. The end of the World War I brought the downfall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, reshaping the map of Europe almost overnight. Austria itself became a much smaller republic, struggling with economic hardship, political unrest, and national humiliation. For many young people growing up in Austria during the 1920s, the atmosphere was one of uncertainty and frustration. Inflation soared, unemployment rose, and political movements, both radical left-wing and extreme right-wing, began attracting followers among those who felt disillusioned by the new order. Goeth was growing into adolescence in exactly this environment. His schooling did not follow a particularly successful path. Reports suggest that he attended several institutions but struggled academically and eventually failed to complete his education in a conventional sense. Rather than pursuing higher studies, he drifted toward technical training connected to the family business. Printing and publishing were trades that offered practical employment, and his parents likely hoped he would eventually contribute to the company. Yet Goeth seemed far more interested in the turbulent political world that surrounded him. The streets of Vienna during the 1920s were often scenes of political demonstrations and ideological conflict. Rival groups clashed openly, and extremist ideas circulated widely. Nationalist organizations promised a revival of German pride, while other movements argued for socialist revolution. Many young men were drawn to paramilitary groups that offered a sense of belonging, discipline, and purpose. It was during these formative years that Goeth began to encounter radical nationalist ideas. Anti-Semitic rhetoric, sadly common in certain circles of Austrian society, was increasingly amplified by political groups that blamed Jews and other minorities for the economic and social struggles of the time. For a young man searching for identity and direction, such ideologies could be powerful. By his late teenage years, Goeth was already drifting toward nationalist activism. Although Austria and Germany were separate states after the First World War, there was a strong movement advocating for their political union. Many Austrian nationalists believed that their country naturally belonged within a greater German nation. This idea would become central to the ideology of the emerging Nazi movement in neighboring Germany. At this stage, Goeth had not yet become the figure history would remember. He was still a young man from Vienna, uncertain about his future and moving between various occupations and interests. But the influences that would shape his worldview were already present: political instability, economic anxiety, and exposure to extremist nationalist propaganda. Family expectations also played a role in shaping his early adulthood. His parents, who had hoped he might settle into the respectable publishing trade, reportedly found him difficult to guide. Goeth showed little enthusiasm for maintaining the family's religious printing business. Instead, he increasingly gravitated toward political organizations and social circles that embraced aggressive nationalism. The late 1920s were a period when the ideology of Adolf Hitler and his followers was spreading rapidly beyond Germany's borders. Hitler's movement promised national revival, strength, and unity under authoritarian leadership. For many disillusioned young men in Austria, these ideas held a powerful appeal. Goeth was among those who began moving closer to these radical circles. Even before the Nazis formally took power in Germany in 1933, their influence was already growing within Austria. Underground networks, sympathizers, and political activists worked to spread the ideology despite government opposition. Goeth's early involvement with nationalist organizations during this time marked the beginning of a path that would ultimately lead him into the ranks of the Nazi regime. Looking back at his childhood and youth, historians often debate how much of Goeth's later brutality can be traced to these early experiences. Some argue that the violent political climate of post-World War I Europe helped normalize extremist thinking for many young men. Others point out that thousands grew up in the same conditions yet did not become perpetrators of mass violence. What can be said with certainty is that Goeth's formative years occurred during one of the most volatile periods in modern European history. The collapse of empires, economic despair, and the rise of radical ideology created an environment in which dangerous ideas could take root. For Goeth, those ideas would eventually lead him into the inner structures of one of the most brutal regimes the world had ever seen. The boy who grew up among the publishing houses and busy streets of Vienna would, within a few decades, become a figure synonymous with cruelty in the Nazi camp system. But at this point in the story, the transformation was not yet complete. He was still simply Amon Goeth, an aimless young man searching for direction in a broken Europe. The choices he would make in the coming years would change not only his own life, but the lives of thousands who would later fall under his authority. And those choices would begin with a step that would bind him permanently to the machinery of Nazi power. To understand how Amon Goeth eventually became one of the most feared figures in the Nazi camp system, it is necessary to understand the world that produced him. The rise of Nazism in Europe was not sudden. It was the result of deep political turmoil, economic collapse, national humiliation, and the manipulation of fear and resentment. In the years following the end of the World War I, Europe entered a period of profound instability. Millions had died in the war, empires had collapsed, and new borders were drawn across the continent. Among the defeated nations, Germany and Austria were left economically shattered and politically fractured. For many Germans and Austrians, the peace settlement that followed the war felt like an unbearable humiliation. The most significant document shaping Germany's future was the Treaty of Versailles. This treaty forced Germany to accept responsibility for the war, imposed massive financial reparations, and drastically reduced the country's military power. The consequences were devastating. Germany's economy began to collapse under the weight of reparations and political chaos. By the early 1920s, the country was experiencing one of the worst inflation crises in modern history. At the height of hyperinflation, the German currency became nearly worthless. Ordinary citizens needed wheelbarrows full of money just to buy bread. For many people, this crisis destroyed their trust in democracy. The German government during this period, known as the Weimar Republic, struggled to maintain stability. Political violence became common. Street battles between extremist groups, communists on one side and nationalist militias on the other, were frequent. Across Germany and Austria, many citizens began searching for strong leadership and radical solutions. This was the environment in which the Nazi movement emerged. At the center of this movement was a charismatic and deeply controversial figure, Adolf Hitler. Born in Austria but politically active in Germany, Hitler had served as a soldier during World War I. After the war, he became involved with a small nationalist political organization that would eventually become the Nazi Party. Hitler quickly proved to be a powerful orator. His speeches were filled with fiery nationalism, promises of restoring German greatness, and bitter attacks against those he blamed for the country's problems. Chief among his targets were Jews, whom Nazi propaganda falsely accused of controlling banks, media, and politics. This dangerous ideology became known as Nazism. Nazism combined extreme nationalism, racial theories, and authoritarian leadership. It promoted the idea that Germans belonged to a superior, Aryan race and that the nation needed to be purified of those considered undesirable. Jews, Roma people, political opponents, and many others were portrayed as enemies of the state. These ideas were not entirely new in Europe, but the Nazis packaged them into a powerful political movement. The early years of Hitler's political career were far from successful. In 1923, he attempted to seize power in Munich during an event known as the Beer Hall Putsch. The attempt failed, and Hitler was arrested and imprisoned. Ironically, this setback helped expand his influence. While in prison, Hitler wrote a political manifesto called Mein Kampf, in which he laid out the ideological foundations of Nazism. The book described his vision of a racially pure German state and his plans for expansion across Europe. During the late 1920s, the Nazi Party slowly began gaining supporters. However, the true turning point came with the global economic disaster known as the Great Depression. The collapse of financial markets sent shockwaves across the world. In Germany, millions lost their jobs, banks failed, and poverty spread rapidly. In times of desperation, extremist movements often gained strength. The Nazis exploited the crisis with remarkable skill. Their propaganda promised jobs, national pride, and strong leadership. They blamed Germany's problems on the Treaty of Versailles, democratic politicians, communists, and above all, Jews. Large rallies, dramatic speeches, and powerful propaganda posters helped spread their message across the country. By the early 1930s, the Nazi Party had transformed from a fringe political group into one of the largest political forces in Germany. Their paramilitary wing, the Sturmabteilung, marched through the streets wearing brown uniforms and intimidating political opponents. Violence became a tool of political power. In 1933, after years of political instability, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. This moment marked the beginning of a dramatic transformation. Within months, the Nazis dismantled the democratic system and established a totalitarian dictatorship. Political opponents were arrested. Independent newspapers were shut down. Civil liberties disappeared. Soon after consolidating power, the Nazis began building a vast security apparatus designed to enforce their ideology. One of the most powerful organizations within this system was the Schutzstaffel, commonly known as the SS. Originally formed as Hitler's personal bodyguard unit, the SS evolved into a massive organization responsible for intelligence, policing, and eventually the administration of concentration camps. Its members were expected to demonstrate absolute loyalty to Hitler and unwavering commitment to Nazi racial ideology. For many ambitious young men in Germany and Austria, joining Nazi organizations offered opportunities for advancement, power, and belonging. The movement also spread beyond Germany's borders, particularly into Austria, where many nationalists supported the idea of uniting the two countries. Although the Austrian government initially resisted Nazi influence, underground supporters continued to grow in number. Among those who became attracted to this ideology was Amon Goeth. Like many others of his generation, Goeth had grown up in a world marked by political upheaval and economic uncertainty. The promises of strength, order, and national revival offered by Nazism could appear seductive to individuals seeking purpose. By the early 1930s, the Nazi movement was transforming from a radical political party into a state-controlled machine of power and repression. Those who joined its ranks would soon become part of a system that would plunge Europe into another catastrophic conflict. And for Amon Goeth, the rise of Nazism would open a path that led directly into the inner machinery of that regime, a path that would eventually place him at the center of one of the most brutal chapters of the 20th century. By the early 1930s, the political landscape of Central Europe had changed dramatically. The influence of the Nazi movement was expanding rapidly, and its ideology was beginning to reshape the future of Germany and neighboring regions. For many young men searching for purpose, identity, and opportunity, the rising tide of Nazism offered a powerful sense of belonging. Among those drawn into this movement was Amon Goeth. Goeth's early years had already exposed him to nationalist ideas and political unrest. Growing up in the turbulent aftermath of the First World War, he had witnessed the collapse of empires, economic hardship, and the growing appeal of radical political movements. Like many of his contemporaries, he found himself attracted to the ideology spreading from Germany under the leadership of Adolf Hitler. By the late 1920s, Hitler's political movement had already begun gaining followers beyond Germany's borders. In Austria, where Goeth lived, Nazi sympathizers were increasingly active despite government opposition. Austrian authorities viewed the Nazi movement as a threat to national stability, and political organizations connected to Hitler were officially banned. But prohibition did not stop their growth. Instead, the Nazi movement in Austria began operating underground. Secret meetings, clandestine recruitment efforts, and covert propaganda campaigns spread throughout the country. Nationalist activists continued to promote the idea that Austria should eventually unite with Germany in a single German state. For Goeth, this ideology proved appealing. In 1930, at the age of 21, he formally joined the Nazi Party. At the time, the Nazi Party was still gaining strength, but it had already begun transforming itself into a disciplined and highly organized political force. Membership in the party meant more than simply supporting a political platform. It meant embracing an entire worldview built around racial ideology, authoritarian leadership, and militant nationalism. Members were expected to demonstrate loyalty to Hitler and commitment to the movement's goals. For ambitious young recruits, joining the party also offered opportunities. Nazi organizations promised advancement, camaraderie, and a sense of purpose. In an era when economic uncertainty had left many young men struggling to find stable careers, the structure of the Nazi movement could appear attractive. It offered uniforms, ranks, and a clearly defined hierarchy. Soon after joining the Nazi Party, Goeth also became involved with one of its most powerful and feared institutions, the Schutzstaffel, widely known simply as the SS. Originally created as a small bodyguard unit for Hitler, the SS had begun evolving into a much larger and more influential organization. Under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler, the SS developed into a highly disciplined elite force within the Nazi system. Its members were carefully selected and expected to demonstrate absolute loyalty to Nazi ideology. Unlike other political organizations, the SS emphasized racial purity and ideological commitment. Applicants were often required to provide extensive documentation proving their Aryan ancestry, reflecting the deeply racist worldview at the core of Nazi doctrine. Goeth joined the SS in 1932. At the time, the organization was rapidly expanding as the Nazi movement gained political momentum. Membership in the SS offered prestige within Nazi circles and often opened the door to positions of authority within the growing structure of the regime. For Goeth, this step marked a decisive turning point in his life. His involvement in the SS also placed him within networks of individuals who were deeply committed to the Nazi cause. Training, meetings, and political activities reinforced the ideological beliefs of members while strengthening their loyalty to the movement. The culture within these organizations was intense. Discipline, obedience, and ideological conformity were emphasized above all else. Members were taught to view the Nazi mission as a historic struggle to restore German greatness and reshape Europe according to racial principles. As the early 1930s progressed, events in Germany accelerated the rise of the Nazi regime. In 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor, marking the beginning of the Nazi takeover of the German state. Within a short period, democratic institutions were dismantled, and Germany became a dictatorship. For Nazi supporters across Central Europe, this moment appeared to confirm the success of the movement. In Austria, however, the situation remained complicated. The Austrian government continued resisting Nazi influence and attempted to suppress pro-Nazi organizations. Membership in the Nazi Party remained illegal, forcing Austrian supporters to operate secretly. This created an environment of political tension and occasional violence. Underground Nazi activists frequently clashed with Austrian authorities. Some participated in propaganda campaigns, while others became involved in plots aimed at undermining the government. These activities were part of a broader effort to bring Austria under Nazi control. Goeth's involvement with the Nazi movement during this period placed him within these networks of activists. Although he was not yet a prominent figure, his participation demonstrated a growing commitment to the ideology that would later define his career. By aligning himself with the SS and the Nazi Party, he had effectively tied his future to the success of the Nazi regime. For many individuals within the movement, loyalty and ideological enthusiasm could lead to rapid advancement once the Nazis consolidated power. As the decade progressed, the political situation in Europe continued to shift dramatically. Nazi Germany expanded its influence, and the dream of uniting all German-speaking territories under Hitler's rule became increasingly central to Nazi policy. This ambition would soon lead to a historic turning point. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria in an event known as the Anschluss. The takeover was swift and largely unopposed by the weakened Austrian government. For Austrian Nazis like Amon Goeth, the Anschluss transformed their position overnight. What had once been an illegal underground movement suddenly became the ruling authority. Party members who had previously operated in secret were now part of the official structure of the Nazi state. This moment opened new opportunities for individuals who had demonstrated loyalty to the movement during its earlier struggles. For Goeth, it marked the beginning of a path that would lead deeper into the machinery of the Nazi regime. As the SS expanded its role within the government and military structures of the Third Reich, loyal members could rise through the ranks and gain positions of authority. In the coming years, Goeth would take advantage of those opportunities. His commitment to the Nazi cause would eventually place him in positions where he held power over the lives of thousands of people. But at this stage in his story, he was still just one of many recruits within a rapidly expanding organization. The full consequences of that allegiance, and the brutality it would unleash, were still yet to come. By the time Amon Goeth became involved with the Nazi movement, one organization had already begun transforming into one of the most powerful and feared institutions in Europe, the Schutzstaffel, more commonly known as the SS. What had originally started as a small personal bodyguard unit for Adolf Hitler gradually evolved into an elite and highly ideological force within the Nazi regime. Unlike the broader Nazi Party or its paramilitary wing, the SS was designed to be a carefully controlled organization whose members would represent the most loyal and committed followers of Hitler's vision. Joining the SS was not simply a matter of signing a membership form. It involved a process that emphasized ideological devotion, discipline, and the belief that members were part of a racial and political elite. For young men like Goeth, the SS represented opportunity. It offered status, authority, and a clear identity within the rapidly expanding Nazi power structure. But it also required absolute obedience and a willingness to internalize the regime's extreme worldview. The SS was heavily shaped by the leadership of Heinrich Himmler, who transformed it into a vast network of institutions responsible for intelligence, policing, racial policy, and eventually the management of concentration camps. Himmler envisioned the SS as the ideological guardians of the Nazi state. To achieve this goal, the organization created an intense culture of loyalty and indoctrination. Recruitment standards were strict. Applicants were expected to demonstrate what the Nazis considered racial purity. This meant presenting family records proving so-called Aryan ancestry, often going back several generations. The purpose of this process was to reinforce the Nazi belief in racial hierarchy, a doctrine that would later justify the regime's brutal policies across Europe. Once accepted, recruits entered a system of training designed not only to develop physical capability but also to reshape their worldview. Physical training was rigorous. Recruits were pushed through demanding exercises meant to build endurance, strength, and discipline. Long marches, weapons training, and tactical drills were standard components of SS preparation. These activities were intended to produce soldiers who could endure hardship and operate effectively in military or security roles. But the physical training was only one part of the process. Equally important was ideological instruction. SS members attended lectures and educational sessions that promoted Nazi racial theories and political doctrine. They were taught that history was a struggle between races and that the German people represented a superior civilization destined to dominate Europe. These lessons repeatedly emphasized loyalty to Hitler and the importance of carrying out orders without hesitation. In this environment, recruits were encouraged to view themselves as members of a special brotherhood, an elite force tasked with protecting the future of the German nation. The sense of belonging that emerged from this culture could be powerful, particularly for individuals who had previously struggled to find direction in civilian life. For Goeth, the SS offered both structure and identity. Like many others who joined the organization, he was immersed in a culture that glorified discipline, authority, and ideological purity. Over time, these influences helped shape the attitudes that would later define his behavior. One of the most disturbing aspects of SS training was its deliberate effort to normalize cruelty. Instructors emphasized the idea that compassion for enemies of the Nazi state was a weakness. Recruits were taught to view certain groups, especially Jews, political opponents, and other minorities, as threats to the survival of Germany. By constantly repeating these messages, the training system attempted to remove moral hesitation and replace it with unquestioning obedience. This psychological conditioning would later play a major role in enabling the violence carried out by SS members across occupied Europe. The SS was also organized with a strict hierarchy that rewarded loyalty and ambition. Members who demonstrated commitment to the ideology and effectiveness in their duties could rise through the ranks. Promotions brought increased authority and greater influence within the expanding Nazi system. For many recruits, this structure created a powerful incentive. Ambitious individuals quickly realized that the SS could provide career advancement far beyond what might have been possible in civilian life. Positions in the organization often came with privileges, social status, and access to the inner circles of Nazi power. By the mid-1930s, as the Nazi regime consolidated control over Germany, the SS was expanding rapidly. New departments were created to manage intelligence operations, police functions, and eventually the growing network of concentration camps. The camps themselves had initially been established to imprison political opponents. But as Nazi racial policies intensified, they became instruments of systematic persecution. SS officers were responsible for guarding prisoners, enforcing discipline, and carrying out the orders of the regime. Within this environment, the line between authority and brutality often disappeared. Many SS leaders encouraged harsh treatment of prisoners as a demonstration of strength and loyalty to the state. The culture of the organization increasingly rewarded those who carried out orders without hesitation, even when those orders involved violence or repression. For recruits like Goeth, exposure to this system reinforced the lessons they had absorbed during training. The ideology they had studied in classrooms was now connected to real-world power over others. It was during these years that the SS began establishing itself as one of the most dominant institutions within Nazi Germany. Its influence extended into nearly every aspect of the regime's operations, from intelligence gathering to racial policy enforcement. By the end of the 1930s, the organization had become central to the machinery of the Nazi state. For individuals inside the SS, loyalty to the organization was often placed above loyalty to any other institution. Members were taught that they were part of a historic mission to reshape Europe according to Nazi ideology. This belief created a sense of destiny among many within its ranks. For Amon Goeth, the SS would become the pathway to authority and power. The training, indoctrination, and culture he experienced within the organization would shape his attitudes and prepare him for the roles he would later assume during the war. What began as membership in an elite political organization would soon place him at the center of one of the most brutal systems of repression in modern history. As the decade progressed and tensions across Europe continued to rise, the Nazi regime was preparing for expansion and conflict. The SS, with its disciplined ranks and ideological commitment, would play a crucial role in those plans. And for Goeth, the next chapter of his life would unfold alongside the outbreak of a war that would engulf the entire continent. By the late 1930s, Europe stood on the edge of another devastating conflict. The ambitions of Adolf Hitler and the growing power of Nazi Germany had begun to destabilize the fragile peace that had existed since the end of the World War I. For men like Amon Goeth, who had committed themselves to the Nazi movement and the ranks of the Schutzstaffel, the coming conflict would present opportunities for power, authority, and advancement within the rapidly expanding Nazi system. But the road to war had been building for years. After consolidating power in Germany in 1933, Hitler moved quickly to transform the country into a militarized state. The Nazi government began rebuilding Germany's armed forces, openly violating the restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. Factories were converted to produce weapons, the military expanded rapidly, and massive propaganda campaigns promoted nationalism and loyalty to the regime. At the same time, Hitler pursued an aggressive foreign policy aimed at expanding German territory. One of the earliest major steps in this expansion came in 1938 with the annexation of Austria in an event known as the Anschluss. German troops entered Austria without significant resistance, and the country was absorbed into the German Reich. For Austrian Nazis like Amon Goeth, this moment marked a dramatic transformation. What had once been a banned political movement within Austria suddenly became the ruling authority. Party members who had previously operated in secrecy were now part of the official structure of Nazi power. But Hitler's ambitions did not stop there. Later that same year, Germany demanded control of the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a large ethnic German population. European leaders attempted to avoid war by negotiating with Hitler at the Munich Agreement. The agreement allowed Germany to annex the territory in exchange for a promise of peace. That promise would not last long. In March 1939, German forces occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, revealing that Hitler's ambitions extended far beyond protecting ethnic Germans. His ultimate goal was the expansion of German power across Eastern Europe and the creation of what the Nazis called Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people. The next target would be Poland. On September 1, 1939, Germany launched a massive military invasion of Poland. The attack was swift and overwhelming, utilizing a new form of warfare known as blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Tanks, aircraft, and infantry advanced rapidly, breaking through Polish defenses and capturing territory with incredible speed. This invasion triggered the beginning of the World War II. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. What had begun as a regional conflict quickly escalated into a global struggle that would involve dozens of nations and reshape the course of history. For Nazi Germany, the early stages of the war appeared remarkably successful. Within weeks, Poland was defeated and divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. Millions of civilians suddenly found themselves living under Nazi occupation. In these newly conquered territories, the Nazi regime began implementing its ideological policies with ruthless efficiency. This included the persecution of Jews and other groups whom the Nazis considered enemies of the state. In occupied Poland, ghettos were established to isolate Jewish communities from the rest of society. Families were forced from their homes and crowded into restricted areas where food was scarce and living conditions were brutal. At the same time, the SS began expanding its role in controlling the occupied territories. Special SS units were deployed behind the advancing German army with orders to eliminate political opponents, intellectuals, and other individuals considered threats to Nazi authority. These operations were part of a broader strategy aimed at reshaping the social structure of Eastern Europe according to Nazi racial ideology. For members of the SS, the war dramatically increased their power and influence. The organization was no longer simply an elite political force within Germany. It had become a central instrument of occupation, repression, and ideological enforcement across large portions of Europe. This expansion created opportunities for ambitious officers to rise through the ranks. Amon Goeth was among those whose careers began advancing during this period. His loyalty to the Nazi movement and his position within the SS placed him within a system that rewarded dedication to the regime's goals. As the war continued, Germany launched a series of rapid military campaigns across Europe. In 1940, German forces invaded and quickly defeated Denmark and Norway. Soon after, the German army launched a massive offensive in Western Europe, capturing Belgium, the Netherlands, and France in a matter of weeks. These victories stunned the world and gave the impression that Nazi Germany was nearly unstoppable. Behind the front lines, however, the SS continued building the infrastructure of repression that would define the Nazi occupation. New camps were established to imprison political prisoners, resistance fighters, and other individuals targeted by the regime. These camps would eventually become central components of the system of persecution that spread throughout Nazi-controlled territory. Within this system, SS officers were responsible for enforcing discipline, maintaining control, and carrying out the orders of the regime. For individuals like Goeth, the war environment provided both authority and opportunity. As the Nazi state expanded its control across Europe, the demand for loyal officers increased. The conflict was no longer just a conventional war between armies. It had become an ideological struggle in which the Nazi leadership sought to reshape entire societies according to their vision of racial hierarchy and total political control. The SS stood at the center of this mission. Its members operated as soldiers, police, and administrators of the regime's most brutal policies. Their authority extended into prisons, ghettos, and camps where millions of people would ultimately suffer under Nazi rule. For Amon Goeth, the war years would bring a steady rise in responsibility within this expanding system. The ideological training he had received and the loyalty he had shown to the Nazi movement positioned him for roles that would place him directly in charge of thousands of prisoners. And as the war deepened and Nazi policies became increasingly radical, those positions of authority would reveal the full extent of the brutality that would later define his name in history. As World War II expanded across Europe, Nazi Germany began building an enormous system of prisons, labor camps, and concentration camps designed to control and exploit the populations of occupied territories. These camps became central to the Nazi regime's policy of persecution and forced labor. One of the most notorious of these camps would emerge in southern Poland, near the historic city of Krakow. It was here that the Nazis established the camp that would later become known as the Plaszów concentration camp. At first, the site was not intended to become one of the most feared camps in Nazi-occupied Poland. In 1942, the area was selected as a forced labor camp to support German war industries. The land itself carried a dark history even before the camp's construction began. The Nazis chose a location that included 2 Jewish cemeteries, which they desecrated during the building process. Gravestones were destroyed, broken apart, and even used as construction materials for roads and camp structures. For the prisoners who would later arrive there, the camp would stand as a symbol of humiliation from the very beginning. During the early phase of construction, Jewish prisoners from nearby ghettos were forced to build the camp themselves. They worked under brutal conditions, digging foundations, constructing barracks, and erecting watchtowers while guarded by armed SS officers. Many of these workers had already been displaced from their homes. In 1941, the German authorities had created the Krakow ghetto, forcing thousands of Jewish residents into a confined district surrounded by walls and barbed wire. Living conditions inside the ghetto were extremely harsh, with overcrowding, hunger, and disease becoming common. As Nazi policy intensified, the ghetto population was gradually deported to camps or killed. Plaszów was designed to absorb many of these prisoners. By 1943, the camp expanded rapidly as the Nazis dismantled the Krakow ghetto. Thousands of men, women, and children were transported to Plaszów, where they were registered as forced laborers. Families were often separated upon arrival, and prisoners were assigned to different work details across the camp and nearby factories. Life inside Plaszów quickly became defined by fear and hardship. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire fences and guarded by SS soldiers and armed watchtowers. Escape was nearly impossible. Prisoners lived in overcrowded wooden barracks where sanitation was poor and food was severely limited. Daily life revolved around forced labor. Every morning, prisoners were forced to assemble for roll call before being marched to work assignments. Many were sent to quarries, factories, and construction sites where they labored for long hours under the supervision of guards. Exhaustion was constant, and injuries were common. Food rations were barely enough to sustain life. Starvation became a daily reality for many prisoners. A typical meal might consist of thin soup and a small piece of bread. Malnutrition weakened prisoners, making them vulnerable to illness and unable to endure the relentless demands of forced labor. Punishments were swift and often deadly. Even minor infractions, working too slowly, speaking without permission, or failing to follow orders, could result in severe beatings or execution. Guards used violence freely to maintain control, creating an atmosphere where fear governed every moment of life. In 1943, the camp's leadership changed dramatically with the arrival of Amon Goeth. Goeth was appointed commandant of Plaszów, placing him in direct authority over thousands of prisoners and SS personnel. With this position came enormous power, and almost no oversight. Under his command, the camp's reputation for brutality intensified. Goeth quickly became known for his violent temper and unpredictable behavior. Survivors later described him as a man who ruled the camp through terror, using cruelty as a method of control. One of the most infamous aspects of Goeth's rule involved the balcony of his villa overlooking the camp. From this elevated position, he reportedly used a rifle to shoot prisoners at random. According to testimonies from survivors, Goeth sometimes treated these killings as a form of sport. Prisoners working in the camp below knew that at any moment, they could become targets. This constant threat created a terrifying psychological environment. Workers in the camp moved with extreme caution, aware that even a small mistake could attract deadly attention. Many prisoners described living with the feeling that death could come without warning. Executions were not limited to these shootings. Goeth frequently ordered public punishments and hangings intended to intimidate the entire prisoner population. Roll calls could last for hours as prisoners were forced to stand while witnessing the punishment of others. These events were meant to reinforce the absolute power of the camp authorities. The conditions inside Plaszów became increasingly severe as the war progressed. Overcrowding worsened, food supplies diminished, and forced labor intensified. Prisoners were pushed beyond physical limits, and those who became too weak to work were often removed from the camp. For many, removal meant death. Disease also spread rapidly through the camp due to poor sanitation and inadequate medical care. In the crowded barracks, illness could sweep through entire groups of prisoners in a short period of time. Despite these conditions, some prisoners attempted to maintain fragments of humanity. They formed small networks of mutual support, sharing food when possible or helping the sick survive another day. These acts of solidarity became a quiet form of resistance against the system designed to destroy them. Yet the power structure of the camp remained firmly in the hands of the SS and its commandant. Goeth's authority was nearly absolute. His decisions could determine whether a prisoner lived or died, and his reputation for cruelty made him one of the most feared figures in the Nazi camp system. The terror that defined Plaszów during his command would later become widely known through survivor testimonies and historical investigations. For those who lived through it, the camp represented one of the darkest examples of how unchecked power, combined with ideological hatred, could transform ordinary locations into places of unimaginable suffering. And under Amon Goeth's leadership, Plaszów would become a symbol of that terror, one where thousands endured brutal labor, constant fear, and the ever-present shadow of death. Amid the brutality and fear that defined the Plaszów concentration camp, there existed a strange and complicated relationship between two very different men. One represented the cruelty of the Nazi system, while the other would later become known for saving more than 1,000 lives. These two men were Amon Goeth and Oskar Schindler. Their interaction would become one of the most dramatic and morally complex stories to emerge from Nazi-occupied Poland. Oskar Schindler was not, at least at the beginning, a hero in the traditional sense. Born in 1908 in what is now the Czech Republic, Schindler was a businessman who joined the Nazi Party during the early years of the war. Like many entrepreneurs in Nazi-controlled Europe, he initially saw the conflict as an opportunity for profit. When Germany occupied Poland in 1939 during the early phase of World War II, Schindler moved to the city of Krakow. There he acquired a factory that produced enamelware, metal kitchen products used by the German military. At first, Schindler's motives appeared purely economic. Jewish labor was extremely cheap under Nazi occupation, and many German business owners exploited this system to increase profits. Schindler employed Jewish workers in his factory because they cost less than Polish laborers, and the Nazi authorities actively encouraged such arrangements. However, as the war continued and the persecution of Jews intensified, something began to change. Schindler witnessed firsthand the brutality carried out by the Nazi authorities. When the German government began dismantling Jewish ghettos and transporting their residents to camps, the situation for Jewish workers became increasingly desperate. One of the most violent episodes occurred during the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto in 1943. During this operation, SS units stormed the ghetto, forcing thousands of Jewish residents from their homes. Many were shot in the streets, while others were deported to camps. The chaos and violence of this event shocked even some individuals within the Nazi system. Schindler was reportedly among those who witnessed the destruction of the ghetto. This event had a profound impact on him. As the ghetto was emptied, many surviving Jews were transported to Plaszów, the camp commanded by Amon Goeth. This meant that the workers Schindler depended on, and increasingly cared about, now fell under the authority of one of the most brutal figures in the Nazi camp system. To continue operating his factory, Schindler needed to maintain a working relationship with Goeth. This relationship was unusual and often tense. Goeth was known for his unpredictable temper and ruthless behavior. He ruled the camp through fear, ordering punishments and executions with little hesitation. For prisoners, he represented absolute power. Schindler, however, approached the situation differently. Using charm, gifts, and lavish dinners, he cultivated a friendship, or at least a strategic alliance, with Goeth. Schindler often entertained Nazi officers, providing alcohol, food, and expensive items that were difficult to obtain during wartime. These gestures helped him gain influence. Through this relationship, Schindler was able to negotiate for the transfer of certain prisoners from the camp to his factory. He argued that these workers were essential for production and therefore should remain alive and capable of working. In reality, these transfers often saved lives. Workers who were assigned to Schindler's factory experienced conditions that were significantly less brutal than those in the camp. Although they were still technically prisoners within the Nazi system, Schindler made efforts to provide them with better food and protection from arbitrary violence. For the prisoners, employment in Schindler's factory became a rare chance for survival. Meanwhile, Goeth continued ruling Plaszów with relentless cruelty. The contrast between the two men could not have been more striking. Goeth often displayed open contempt for prisoners and frequently resorted to violence to assert his authority. Schindler, on the other hand, gradually began using his influence to shield as many workers as possible. Yet their relationship remained complex. Schindler needed Goeth's cooperation to protect his workers. Maintaining that cooperation required careful diplomacy and constant negotiation. At times, Schindler even appeared to indulge Goeth's behavior in order to maintain access to the prisoners. This delicate balance allowed him to expand the number of workers under his protection. As the war progressed, the situation for Jews across Nazi-controlled Europe became even more dangerous. Deportations to extermination camps increased, and the Nazi regime began implementing what it called the final solution, the systematic attempt to eliminate the Jewish population of Europe. Within this deadly environment, Schindler took increasingly bold steps. He continued arguing that his workers were essential for the German war effort, ensuring that they remained classified as necessary laborers rather than being sent to extermination camps. In some cases, he reportedly falsified production reports or bribed officials to maintain this protection. These actions carried significant risk. Helping Jews was considered a serious crime under Nazi law, and anyone caught assisting them could face severe punishment or execution. Yet Schindler continued expanding his efforts, eventually creating a list of workers he intended to transfer to a safer factory location. This document would later become known as Schindler's List. The list contained the names of more than 1,000 Jewish men and women who were moved to a factory in what is now the Czech Republic, where they remained relatively protected until the end of the war. For those individuals, Schindler's actions meant survival. In contrast, Amon Goeth's legacy would be remembered for the suffering inflicted under his command at Plaszów. The strange connection between these two men, one a brutal camp commandant, the other a businessman who gradually became a rescuer, stands as one of the most dramatic moral contrasts within the history of the Holocaust. Their relationship revealed the complex and often contradictory realities that existed within the Nazi system. While Goeth represented the ruthless enforcement of Nazi ideology, Schindler's actions showed that even within that oppressive structure, individual choices could still alter the fate of others. For the prisoners of Plaszów and Schindler's factory, those choices made the difference between life and death. By 1944, the power of Amon Goeth inside the Plaszów concentration camp had become almost absolute. As the camp's commandant, Goeth controlled the daily lives of thousands of prisoners. His orders determined who worked, who was punished, and in many cases, who lived or died. Yet the same authority that allowed him to rule the camp with terror also created opportunities for corruption. The Nazi camp system was supposed to operate under strict discipline and centralized control. Camps like Plaszów were part of a larger structure overseen by the SS leadership, which included officials responsible for managing prisoners, property confiscations, and forced labor. However, in reality, the chaotic conditions of war and occupation created opportunities for individuals in positions of authority to abuse their power. Goeth was no exception. Over time, reports began circulating that he was enriching himself through illegal activities connected to the camp. As thousands of prisoners passed through Plaszów, the Nazi authorities confiscated enormous amounts of property. Jewelry, money, clothing, and other valuables were taken from prisoners upon arrival. Officially, these items were supposed to be recorded and transferred to the German state. But many SS officers secretly kept a portion of these valuables for themselves. Goeth allegedly went much further than that. According to later investigations, he accumulated large quantities of stolen property from prisoners. Precious items such as gold, cash, and luxury goods were reportedly stored in his personal residence or hidden away rather than being handed over to the authorities as required. In addition to confiscated valuables, Goeth also used prisoners as personal servants. Some prisoners were forced to work directly for him in his villa near the camp. They cleaned his home, prepared meals, and performed various household duties. While forced labor was common throughout the Nazi camp system, using prisoners for private domestic work was often considered a violation of official regulations. But corruption within the camp extended beyond material wealth. Goeth was also accused of manipulating the camp's prisoner lists and labor assignments for personal gain. Some individuals were reportedly transferred, protected, or punished depending on whether they could provide something of value to the camp authorities. These actions gradually attracted attention from within the Nazi system itself. Although the SS was responsible for some of the most brutal policies of the regime, it also attempted to maintain strict discipline among its officers. The leadership wanted to ensure that the enormous machinery of camps and forced labor remained under centralized control. Uncontrolled corruption threatened that control. By 1944, rumors about Goeth's behavior had reached higher SS officials. Reports described not only his theft of confiscated property but also financial irregularities connected to camp operations. As a result, an internal investigation was launched. The investigation was conducted by officials within the SS judicial system, which had been established to discipline members who violated the organization's rules. These courts were not designed to protect prisoners or punish brutality against them. Instead, their primary purpose was to ensure loyalty and maintain order within the SS itself. This distinction is important. The investigation into Goeth was not primarily focused on the killings and cruelty that prisoners had suffered under his command. Violence against prisoners was often tolerated, and in many cases even encouraged within the Nazi system. Instead, the investigation centered on corruption. SS authorities accused Goeth of stealing property that technically belonged to the German state. In their view, the issue was not the persecution of prisoners but the unauthorized enrichment of an officer who was supposed to follow strict administrative procedures. Investigators began examining records, interviewing witnesses, and searching for evidence connected to the accusations. Eventually, they gathered enough information to take action. In September 1944, Amon Goeth was arrested by the SS itself. For the prisoners of Plaszów, the sudden removal of the commandant was a surprising and confusing event. Many had lived for months or years under the constant fear of his authority, and his disappearance from the camp marked a dramatic change. However, the reasons behind his arrest were far removed from the suffering that prisoners had endured. The charges against him focused on corruption and financial crimes rather than the widespread violence that had defined his rule. Goeth was formally accused of stealing property from prisoners, illegally enriching himself, and mismanaging resources that were supposed to belong to the Nazi state. The investigation also examined his use of prisoners for private labor and other abuses of authority. For the SS leadership, these actions represented violations of discipline and loyalty within the organization. They feared that unchecked corruption could undermine the efficiency of the camp system and damage the reputation of the SS. Yet the investigation did not erase the terror that Goeth had imposed during his time as commandant. For the thousands who had suffered under his rule, the arrest offered little sense of justice. The Nazi system itself remained intact, and the camp continued operating under new leadership. Nevertheless, the investigation revealed something important about the internal dynamics of the regime. Even within an organization responsible for immense brutality, strict rules and hierarchies governed how power was supposed to be exercised. Officers who violated those internal rules, particularly when it involved money or property, could face punishment from their own superiors. In Goeth's case, the corruption charges would temporarily end his command at Plaszów. But the collapse of Nazi Germany was already approaching. As the war turned against Germany and Allied forces advanced across Europe, many officials connected to the camp system would soon face a far greater reckoning than internal SS discipline. And for Amon Goeth, the next stage of his story would unfold after the fall of the regime he had served. The figure who had once been feared throughout the camp was now gone. After his arrest, Goeth was transferred to Berlin, where SS authorities continued examining the accusations against him. During this period he remained under SS custody while officials attempted to determine the extent of his corruption. But the larger situation in Europe was rapidly changing. By late 1944, Nazi Germany was facing defeat on multiple fronts. Allied forces were advancing from the west after the Normandy landings earlier that year, while the Soviet army pushed westward from the east, capturing territory that Germany had occupied since the early years of the war. The once unstoppable expansion of Nazi Germany had come to an end. For the leadership of the Third Reich, the priority was no longer expansion but survival. Military resources were stretched thin, cities were under constant bombardment, and the German government was struggling to maintain control as the war turned decisively against them. Within this chaotic environment, internal investigations such as the one against Goeth gradually lost urgency. The SS had far greater concerns than the corruption of a single officer. The collapse of Nazi Germany itself was becoming increasingly likely. During this period, Goeth's case remained unresolved. The SS investigation continued but never reached a final verdict before the war ended. Instead, the dramatic events unfolding across Europe would soon overshadow the internal disciplinary procedures of the Nazi regime. Meanwhile, the camp that Goeth had once commanded was also undergoing changes. As Soviet forces advanced toward Poland, the Nazis began dismantling and evacuating many camps in the region. Prisoners were forced onto long marches toward camps deeper inside Germany, a desperate attempt by the Nazi authorities to prevent them from being liberated by advancing Allied troops. These evacuations became known as death marches. Thousands of prisoners died from exhaustion, starvation, or execution during these forced movements. The final months of the war were among the most chaotic and deadly periods for those trapped within the Nazi camp system. For Goeth, however, the situation was very different. After losing his command and spending time under SS investigation, he was eventually released from internal custody as the war situation deteriorated. By that point, the Nazi government was collapsing, and many officials were attempting to distance themselves from the crimes committed during the regime. As Germany's defeat approached, Goeth disappeared into the chaos of the collapsing Reich. The once powerful commandant who had ruled Plaszów with absolute authority was now simply another fugitive within a dying regime. The structures that had protected him, the SS, the Nazi government, and the entire machinery of occupation, were crumbling under the pressure of Allied victory. In May 1945, Germany officially surrendered, bringing the World War II in Europe to an end. The collapse of Nazi Germany meant that many of its officials would soon face capture by Allied forces. Investigations into war crimes began almost immediately as the world started uncovering the full scale of atrocities committed under Nazi rule. For Amon Goeth, the fall from power that began with his arrest by the SS would soon lead to a far more serious reckoning. The internal corruption charges that once threatened his career would soon seem insignificant compared to the crimes for which he would ultimately be judged. When World War II finally came to an end in Europe in May 1945, the collapse of Nazi Germany revealed the full scale of atrocities that had taken place across the continent. As Allied forces liberated concentration camps and occupied former Nazi territories, investigators began collecting evidence of war crimes committed by officials of the Third Reich. Among those who would soon face justice was Amon Goeth. After losing his position as commandant of the Plaszów concentration camp and disappearing during the final months of the war, Goeth attempted to avoid capture like many other former Nazi officials. As the German state collapsed, thousands of SS officers, soldiers, and administrators tried to hide their identities or blend into the mass of refugees moving across Central Europe. Goeth initially attempted to escape the advancing Allied forces by disguising himself as an ordinary German soldier. Without the uniform and authority that had once made him one of the most feared men in Plaszów, he became just another fugitive in a defeated country. However, his attempt to remain hidden did not last long. In 1945, Goeth was captured by American forces in Germany. At the time of his arrest, Allied authorities were already beginning the enormous task of identifying individuals connected to the Nazi regime and investigating their roles during the war. Goeth's name quickly attracted attention. Survivors of Plaszów and other witnesses had already begun providing testimony about the brutal conditions inside the camp. Reports described a commandant known for violent outbursts, arbitrary executions, and a reign of terror over thousands of prisoners. Because Plaszów had been located in occupied Poland, the responsibility for prosecuting Goeth eventually fell to the Polish authorities. He was transferred to Poland to stand trial for crimes committed during the Nazi occupation. The trial would take place in the city of Krakow, not far from the site of the camp he had once commanded. By the time the trial began in 1946, the world had started to understand the scale of Nazi crimes. The liberation of camps across Europe had revealed mass graves, starvation, forced labor systems, and systematic violence against civilian populations. Goeth would be judged as one of the individuals responsible for these crimes. The case was heard before the Supreme National Tribunal, a special court established in Poland to prosecute major Nazi officials. This tribunal was responsible for investigating crimes committed during the German occupation and holding perpetrators accountable under international and Polish law. During the proceedings, prosecutors presented detailed evidence about Goeth's actions while serving as commandant of Plaszów. Witness testimony became one of the most powerful elements of the trial. Former prisoners described the conditions inside the camp and the fear that dominated daily life. They spoke about forced labor, starvation, public punishments, and executions carried out under Goeth's authority. Some witnesses described the infamous shootings from the balcony of Goeth's villa overlooking the camp. According to their accounts, the commandant would sometimes fire his rifle at prisoners working below, killing individuals without warning. These stories painted a picture of a man who had exercised his power with cruelty and indifference to human life. Other testimonies described the violent punishments carried out during roll calls or inspections. Prisoners recalled being beaten for minor mistakes or watching fellow inmates executed as a warning to others. For many witnesses, the trial represented the first opportunity to confront the man who had once controlled their fate. Goeth himself showed little remorse during the proceedings. Like many former Nazi officials who stood trial after the war, he attempted to defend his actions by claiming that he had simply been following orders within the system of the Nazi state. This argument was common among defendants accused of war crimes. However, prosecutors argued that Goeth's behavior had gone far beyond merely carrying out official duties. They presented evidence that he had personally ordered or carried out numerous executions and had used his authority in ways that demonstrated deliberate cruelty. The court carefully examined the testimony and evidence presented during the trial. After weeks of hearings, the tribunal reached its conclusion. In September 1946, the court found Amon Goeth guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The verdict reflected the overwhelming evidence that had been presented about his actions during the war. The tribunal sentenced him to death. For the survivors of Plaszów and other victims of Nazi persecution, the sentence represented a form of justice, though it could never undo the suffering that had taken place during the years of occupation. The execution was carried out shortly afterward. On September 13, 1946, Amon Goeth was executed by hanging in Krakow. The execution took place not far from the region where he had once exercised power over thousands of prisoners. With his death, the life of one of the most notorious commandants of the Nazi camp system came to an end. Yet the story did not end there. The testimony given during his trial became part of the historical record that documented the crimes committed during the Holocaust. These records helped historians and investigators understand how individuals within the Nazi system carried out acts of violence and repression on a massive scale. For the survivors who testified, the trial served another purpose as well. It ensured that the memory of what had happened at Plaszów would not disappear into silence. The man who had once ruled the camp through fear had finally been held accountable before a court of law. And through the voices of those who had endured his rule, the world learned the full extent of the terror that had defined his command. The name Amon Goeth remains one of the most chilling reminders of the cruelty that emerged during the era of World War II and the systematic persecution carried out under the Nazi regime. Though he was only one individual within a vast machinery of oppression, his actions have come to symbolize the extreme brutality that defined many parts of the Nazi camp system. Today, historians remember Goeth primarily for his role as commandant of the Plaszów concentration camp in occupied Poland. Under his command, the camp became a place of terror where prisoners lived under constant threat of violence, starvation, and execution. For many scholars and survivors, Goeth represents a disturbing example of how ordinary individuals could become agents of cruelty within an authoritarian system. He was not one of the highest-ranking leaders of Nazi Germany, nor was he responsible for designing the ideology of the regime. Instead, he was a mid-level officer who carried out policies of persecution with zeal and personal brutality. This is one of the reasons his story remains so significant in historical discussions of the Holocaust. The crimes committed during the Nazi era were not carried out only by a small number of powerful leaders. They were also made possible by thousands of individuals who enforced orders, managed camps, guarded prisoners, and participated in acts of violence. Goeth's career illustrates how such individuals operated within the system created by the Nazi state. Remembering such stories does not glorify the perpetrators. Instead, it helps ensure that the suffering of the victims is not forgotten. The survivors of camps like Plaszów spent decades sharing their experiences with historians, educators, and younger generations. Their testimonies provide a human voice to the statistics of the Holocaust. Through their memories, the world learns what life was like under the command of men like Goeth. In this sense, the legacy of Amon Goeth is inseparable from the legacy of those who endured the camps and survived to tell their stories. Their courage in speaking about the past ensures that history remains a warning rather than a forgotten tragedy. The study of figures like Goeth reminds humanity that cruelty and violence are not distant possibilities limited to the past. They can emerge whenever prejudice, authoritarianism, and unchecked power take root in society. For that reason, remembering history is not only about understanding what happened. It is about learning how to prevent similar horrors from happening again. And so the story of Amon Goeth ends not simply with his execution in 1946, but with the ongoing effort to remember the victims of the Holocaust and to confront the lessons that history continues to teach. Only through memory, education, and vigilance can the world ensure that the darkness of that era is never repeated.